She was 20 and had just been kicked out. Not with shouting, not with a scene, but with a quiet envelope slid under her door and a key she was asked to leave on the kitchen counter. And with $1 and a bus ticket, she bought a forgotten chapel hidden deep in the woods of upstate New York. The county had stopped mowing the path years ago. The road had been reclaimed by the forest. No one had opened the chapel doors since the 1970s. But what nobody knew was that behind the altar of that small stone chapel, in a compartment that had been sealed for over 50 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elsie Finch had been quiet her whole life. Not shy, exactly. Shy implied nervousness. And Elsie was not nervous. She was watchful. She listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, her voice was low and careful. The voice of someone who had learned early that words had weight and should be chosen with care. Her mother used to say that Elsie had come out of the womb already thinking about something. And that had never changed. She grew up in a small apartment in Albany, New York with her mother, a woman named Cora, who worked as a legal secretary at a downtown law firm. Her father had died when Elsie was 5, an accident at the machine shop where he worked. And after that, it was just the two of them. Cora did her best, which was better than most. She read to Elsie every night until Elsie was too old for it, and then still sometimes after that. She took her to the public library on Saturdays. She kept a small notebook in her purse where she wrote down the things Elsie said that she wanted to remember. Elsie was a writer from the beginning. She filled notebooks with stories and poems and descriptions of people she saw on the bus. She was the kind of child who sat in the corner of a room and watched everything without making a sound, and then went home and wrote it all down in a spiral notebook with a pencil she had sharpened to a perfect point. Her handwriting was small and precise. Each letter formed the same way every time. Her fingertips were always stained with ink. Her mother died when Elsie was 17. Cancer. It moved fast. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Elsie nursed her through all of it, skipping the last semester of her senior year to be home, reading aloud from Cora's favorite books when Cora was too tired to hold them, writing down the things Cora said in the last weeks that Cora wanted to remember. There were no other relatives. Cora had been an only child, and Cora's parents had died years ago. And Cora had never married anyone after Elsie's father. After the funeral, Elsie went to live with a friend of her mother's named Patricia, who had a small house in a suburb north of Albany. Patricia was in her 60s, retired, a kind but somewhat formal woman who had worked at the same law firm as Cora for 20 years. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary while Elsie figured out what she was doing with her life. It lasted 3 years. Patricia was not unkind. She simply had a very particular way of living, and she wanted Elsie to adopt that way of living, and Elsie could not. Patricia believed in schedules. She believed in clean kitchens. She believed that young women should have plans, and the plan should involve college or a stable career, or at least a clear path toward one of those things. Elsie had none of those things. Elsie had a notebook full of stories and a part-time job at a used bookstore downtown, and a vague sense that she wanted to be a writer, which Patricia considered not a plan, but an aspiration. And aspirations were not the same as plans. The conversations grew tense over time. Not hostile, but cooler. Patricia would ask Elsie about her plans at dinner. Elsie would give the same answer she always gave, which was that she was thinking about things. Patricia would sigh in a specific way that said she was disappointed, but too polite to say so directly. The sigh eventually became the primary form of communication in the house. One morning, 3 days after Elsie's 20th birthday, Elsie found an envelope slid under the door of her bedroom. Inside was a letter from Patricia. The letter was polite. It said that Patricia had decided, after much reflection, that the current arrangement was no longer working. It said that Patricia thought Elsie would do better on her own, where she could make her own decisions without feeling judged. It gave Elsie 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. It thanked her for the time they had shared. Elsie read the letter sitting on the edge of her bed. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the back of her notebook and went downstairs and made breakfast the way she always did. 2 slices of toast with butter, and she and Patricia ate together in the kitchen and did not mention the letter. Patricia asked if Elsie wanted more coffee. Elsie said, "No, thank you." They finished breakfast. Patricia went to her book club. Elsie went upstairs and started looking at property listings on her laptop. She had $247 in her bank account. She had been saving from the bookstore job carefully because she had known for months that Patricia's patience was thinning. She didn't want to spend the money on first month's rent for an apartment she probably couldn't afford to keep. She wanted to find something she could own outright, something that couldn't be taken away from her. She searched for tax sales and surplus property listings in upstate New York. She found listings for vacant lots, for half-collapsed mobile homes, for buildings in towns she had never heard of. Most of them cost more than she had. Some of them were haunted-looking in ways that gave her pause, even for someone who wrote stories about haunted places. Then she found the chapel. It was listed on a county tax auction page for a town called Little Falls, about 2 hours west of Albany, in the foothills of the Adirondacks. The listing was brief. It described the property as a historic fieldstone chapel, approximately 400 square feet, located on a 1.5-acre wooded parcel off Old Logging Road. Access by footpath only. No utilities. Condemned 1974. The starting bid was $1. It noted that the chapel had been on the auction list for 11 years with no bidders. The listing included a single photograph, old and grainy, showing a small stone building barely visible through the trees. The photograph looked like it had been taken in the 1970s, which was probably the last time anyone had bothered to take a picture of the chapel at all. Elsie stared at the photograph for a long time. There was something about it that caught her. The way the chapel sat so quietly in the woods, as if it had been waiting. The way the trees grew close around it, but hadn't consumed it. The way the shape of it was unmistakably a chapel, even though you could barely see it through the foliage. That peaked roof, that simple cross at the top. The sense of a small sacred space carved out of the forest by someone who had believed it mattered. She knew the way you sometimes just know that she was going to own that building. She took the bus to Little Falls the next morning. The trip took almost 4 hours because she had to transfer twice. She ate a granola bar in the bus station between transfers and read a paperback of Marilynne Robinson's Gilead, which was a book she had been returning to for months, the way some people return to prayers. When she arrived in Little Falls, she found the county courthouse and went to the clerk's office and asked about the chapel listing. The clerk was a woman in her 40s with curly gray-streaked hair and red reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She looked at Elsie and then at the listing and then back at Elsie. "That old place," she said. "You know it's not really usable, right? No one's been up that road in 40 years. The chapel was built by a small religious community that broke up in the 1970s. The property reverted to the county for unpaid taxes in 1984. We've been trying to sell it ever since." Elsie set $1 on the counter. "I understand," she said. "I'd still like to buy it." The clerk looked at the dollar. Then she looked at Elsie again, more carefully this time. "Honey, are you sure? That's not a building you can just move into. There's no electric, no water, no road you can drive a car on. The path from the road to the chapel is a mile long, and it goes through private timberland owned by a paper company. You'd have to hike in and hike out every time you needed anything." "I understand. And the chapel itself, I've never been inside it, but the condemnation report said the roof had holes. The floor was rotten in places, and there was significant moisture damage. I'm telling you, this is not a place for a 20-year-old girl to try to live." Elsie thought about Patricia's letter, folded in the back of her notebook. She thought about the careful, polite sigh across the breakfast table. She thought about the sentence, where you can make your own decisions without feeling judged. "Ma'am," she said, "I know what I'm looking at. I know it's going to be hard, but I've been told I need to make my own decisions, and this is the one I'm making." The clerk looked at her for a long moment. Then she pulled out a form and started filling it in. "Welcome to Herkimer County," she said, her voice softer than before. "Take care of yourself out there." Elsie walked from the courthouse to the edge of Little Falls, following a map on her phone that led her to an unmarked gravel road, turning off the highway east of town. The walk took almost an hour. She passed a shuttered tire shop, a hardware store that was still open, a small diner with a hand-painted sign, and then the town gave way to farmland, and then the farmland gave way to forest. The gravel road climbed through a stand of maples just starting to turn gold, and then petered out at a turnaround where a hand-lettered wooden sign, faded and leaning, read, "Chapel of the Quiet Woods, Private, 1923. A narrow path led from the turnaround into the forest. The path had clearly not been maintained in decades. Fallen branches lay across it, some of them so large that she had to climb over them or walk around. Moss grew over the path in thick green cushions. Tree roots pushed up through the earth, turning the path into a kind of rough staircase, climbing gently uphill. Elsie walked it slowly, her leather boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The forest was silent except for the soft sound of her own breathing and the occasional call of a crow high in the canopy above. She passed a creek with a rotting wooden footbridge that she tested carefully before crossing. She passed a small granite boulder with an old wooden cross propped against it, marking who knew what. She passed a clearing where something had once been. She could see the stone foundations of a small outbuilding long since collapsed. And then the forest closed in again, and she kept walking. The air was cool and smelled like wet leaves and pine needles and something deeper. The scent of earth that has been sheltered from sun for a very long time. She walked for almost a mile. The path climbed gently, then leveled, then curved around a stand of white birch trees, their bark peeling in long pale curls like the pages of a book left in the rain. And then, in a small natural clearing surrounded by maples and birches, Elsie saw the chapel. It was smaller than she had expected. Smaller and more beautiful. The walls were built of fieldstone, the rocks gray and brown and green with age, each stone carefully fitted against its neighbors. The roof was steep and pitched, covered in slate that had turned almost black over the decades with thick green moss growing in the shaded sections. A simple wooden cross stood at the peak of the roof, leaning slightly to the left. Above the heavy oak double door set into the stone wall was a single arched, stained glass window, the glass faded and dusty, but still holding its colors, blues and golds and a deep red at the center, that caught even the diffused forest light and gave it back in a soft glow. Ivy climbed the left side of the chapel. A mossy stone bench stood beside the door, tilted at an angle from decades of freeze and thaw. A few fallen leaves had gathered on the bench and on the stone threshold. The clearing was silent in the way that old forest clearings are silent, which is not really silent at all, but full of small sounds layered over each other, the drip of water somewhere, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a hawk. Elsie stood at the edge of the clearing and did not move for a long time. She felt something she had not felt since her mother died. She felt found. Not found by another person, found by a place. She walked to the oak doors. They were heavy and the iron hinges were rusted, but when she pushed against them, they opened with a low, slow groan that seemed to come not from the hinges themselves but from the building, as if the chapel were waking up from a very long sleep. The interior was small and still, a single room maybe 20 feet long and 15 feet wide with a peaked ceiling that rose to the underside of the slate roof. The floor was flagstone, the same fieldstone as the walls, laid in uneven pieces with moss growing in the gaps near the corners. 4 narrow wooden pews, simple and unpainted, ran along each side of a central aisle. At the front of the chapel stood a small altar, a rectangular stone block about 3 feet high, with a carved wooden cross mounted on the wall above it. Behind the altar, in the stone wall, was a small recessed niche that had once held a candle or a statue or something, now empty. The stained glass window above the door threw a soft patchwork of colored light across the stone floor in shifting shapes as the afternoon sun moved through the autumn leaves outside. The air smelled like old stone and wet wood and the faint sweet mustiness of a building that had been breathing slowly for 100 years, taking in the seasons and giving them back. Elsie walked the aisle to the altar. The wooden pews creaked faintly as she passed them, as if they were remembering something. At the altar, she stopped and put her hand on the cool stone surface. She stood there for a long moment, just breathing, just being in the room. Then she noticed something. The altar was a stone block, solid-looking, but when she ran her hand along its edge, she felt a thin seam where the top slab met the main body of the altar. The slab was a separate piece, a capstone. She leaned against it gently, and it didn't move. But when she put both hands on it and pushed harder, the slab shifted slightly, a grinding of stone against stone. Elsie looked around the empty chapel. She was alone. The stained glass light moved slowly across the floor. She set her satchel on a pew and walked back to the altar and, with both hands and most of her body weight, pushed the capstone to the side. The stone slab slid about 6 inches, enough to see what was inside. The altar was hollow, a rectangular cavity about 2 feet long and a foot deep carved into the stone. Inside the cavity, resting on a small wooden platform to keep it off the cold stone floor, was an old wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, dark with age, with brass corners and a small padlock on the clasp. Elsie lifted the box out of the cavity. It was heavy. She set it carefully on the altar top and tried the padlock. It was rusted, almost solid. She looked around the chapel for something to break. It within noticed, hanging from a hook beside the altar, an old iron poker, probably from a fireplace that had once been somewhere in the building. She took the poker down and used it as a pry bar, wedging it under the padlock's loop and twisting. The rusted metal snapped on the second try. She opened the box. Inside, wrapped in dark velvet that had kept its shape remarkably well for 50 years, was a stack of old envelopes. Each envelope was sealed with red wax. Each one was addressed in the same precise handwriting, in fountain pen ink, to the next soul. She counted them. 17 envelopes. Beneath the envelopes, in a smaller compartment at the bottom of the box, was money, paper money neatly bundled with cotton string, and beside the money, in a small drawstring pouch of brown leather, was something that clinked softly when she touched it. She opened the pouch. Gold coins. Old gold coins, small and heavy with faces she didn't recognize. She would later learn they were gold sovereigns from the British Mint, dating from the 1890s to the 1930s, brought to America by someone and kept here in this chapel for decades. There were 34 coins in the pouch. Elsie sat down on the nearest pew and set the box carefully on the pew beside her and held one of the sealed envelopes in her hands. The wax seal was a simple impression of a cross. She broke it carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The letter was dated April 1971. It was addressed, as the envelope had said, to the next soul. It read, "Whoever finds this chapel, whoever pushes open the altar stone and lifts out this box, you are the next caretaker of a small piece of peace in the world." This chapel was built in 1923 by a man named Father Ansel Voigt, a German immigrant who came to these woods after the First World War with nothing but grief and the belief that grief required quiet. He built the chapel alone, one stone at a time over 4 years, using field stones he collected from the creeks and hillsides around this clearing. He was not a priest in any official sense. He was simply a man who believed that places of quiet were as necessary as places of noise, and that the world needed more of them. A small community grew up around Father Voigt in the 1920s and 30s. People who had lost something, a war, a child, a faith, and who needed somewhere to sit in silence without explaining themselves. They came here from Little Falls and from farther away. They sat in these pews. They did not always pray. Sometimes they just sat. Father Voigt did not ask them what they were doing. He understood that silence was the service. The community scattered after Father Voigt died in 1957. A few members kept the chapel for a time, coming to maintain it on weekends, but as the years passed and the members grew old or moved away, the visit stopped. I am writing this letter in 1971 knowing I will be the last to come. My name is Margaret Lindholm. I was 12 years old the first time my mother brought me here in 1934 after my younger brother drowned in the Mohawk River. I did not know then that this chapel would be the most important building of my life. I did not know that I would come back year after year for 37 years to sit in these pews and feel my brother's presence in the quiet. The community kept a small fund over the decades donations from members, legacies from the estates of those who passed. The money was used to maintain the chapel, but there is more than we ever needed. The coins came from Father Voigt himself, carried from Germany in his pocket when he emigrated. He never spent them. He said they were for the next generation of caretakers, whoever they might be. I am leaving this box here in the altar because I believe, as Father Voigt believed, that the chapel will find its next caretaker. I do not know who you are. I do not know when you will read this. I only know that if you have found this box, you found it because you needed to find it. Take what you need. Keep the chapel if you can. And if you cannot keep it, at least come here sometimes and sit in the quiet. The quiet is what matters. Everything else is just walls. With peace, Margit Lindholm. June 1971. Elsie read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and sat on the pew with her hands in her lap and the box beside her. And the stained glass light moved slowly across the stone floor. And she did not cry, but her eyes filled with tears. And the tears stayed there without falling. And she understood, very slowly, that the chapel had been waiting for her. Not specifically for her, waiting for whoever needed it. And that was her now. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one, and tell us in the comments, have you ever walked into a place and felt like it had been waiting for you? The paper money in the box came to $21,400. The gold coins, appraised later by a dealer in Syracuse who specialized in British gold, were worth over $38,000 at current market prices. Together with the money from the community fund, Elsie had nearly $60,000 more money than she had ever imagined holding in her life. She spent almost none of it at first. She could not bring herself to spend it carelessly. This was not her money, not really. It was Father Voigt's money and Margit Lindholm's money, and the money of all the people who had come to this chapel over the decades carrying their grief and leaving it here. She wanted to be worthy of it. And being worthy meant spending slowly and carefully, and only on things the chapel actually needed. She rented a small room in a boarding house in Little Falls for the first few months while she worked on the chapel during the days. The boarding house was run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Halpern who did not ask too many questions and who charged $85 a week for a room with a bed, a dresser, and access to a shared bathroom. Elsie would walk to the trailhead each morning, hike the mile to the chapel, work all day, and hike back out in the evening. She started with the roof. The slate was in better condition than anyone had reported, probably because the chapel was so protected by the surrounding trees that it had been spared the worst of the weather. But several slates had slipped, and the flashing around the base of the chimney was gone. She hired a roofer from Herkimer County who was willing to hike in his tools and materials. He spent 3 days on the roof, replacing slipped slates and installing new flashing. And when he was done, he said, "That chapel will last another 100 years if you treat it right." She paid him from the money in the box. She cleaned the interior over the next few weeks. She swept the floor, scrubbed the flagstones with a soft brush and clean water, and polished the pews with beeswax until the old wood glowed warm and dark. She dusted the stained glass window from the inside and the outside, bringing back colors she hadn't been able to see clearly before. She cleaned the altar and the stone niche behind it. She cleaned the small wooden cross that Father Voigt had carved himself. She left the building essentially unchanged. The chapel was not hers to transform, only to care for. In a small stone outbuilding behind the chapel, which Elsie had not noticed the first day but discovered when she was exploring the clearing, she found a tiny one-room structure that had once been a caretaker's shelter. It had a small stove, a simple bed frame, a writing table, and a wood-burning stove for cooking and heating. The shelter was in poor condition, but it was intact. And Elsie realized immediately that it was meant to be lived in. This was where Father Voigt himself had lived. And Margit Lindholm, during the years she had maintained the chapel, would have stayed here, too. Elsie spent part of the fall fixing up the caretaker's shelter. She replaced the rotted floorboards, patched the wood stove chimney, installed a new bed, ran a rainwater collection system off the roof into a stone basin outside the door. She moved out of Mrs. Halpern's boarding house and into the shelter in October before the first snow. The shelter was tiny, maybe 120 square feet, but it was warm, dry, and close to the chapel. She could walk from the shelter to the chapel in under a minute. She started keeping regular hours in the chapel. She would open the heavy oak doors each morning at 8 o'clock and close them each evening at sunset. She did not advertise her presence. She did not put up signs. But slowly, very slowly, people began to find her. The first visitor was an old woman from Little Falls who had remembered as a child her grandmother talking about the chapel. The woman hiked in alone one afternoon, surprised to find the doors open, and sat in the back pew for an hour without saying a word. When she left, she touched Elsie's arm gently and said, "Thank you for keeping this place." The second visitor was a young man in his 30s who had been hiking in the area and had stumbled onto the path by accident. He sat in the chapel for 20 minutes and then asked Elsie if he could leave a note in the pouch by the door. Elsie had placed a small leather pouch by the entrance for visitors to leave notes or messages if they wished. She found, over time, that more and more of the notes contained the names of people who had died. By the end of the first winter, word of the chapel had begun to spread. Not widely, just quietly, the way words spread about places that people recognize as important. People began hiking in from towns hours away, carrying their own grief, their own quiet questions, their own needs for a place to sit without explaining themselves. Elsie never turned anyone away. She also never advertised, never put the chapel on a website, never did anything that would make it a destination. The chapel, she understood, worked because it was hard to find. The difficulty of finding it was part of what made it sacred. By spring, Elsie had begun writing again. Not the story she had written as a teenager, but something different. Short reflections, observations about the visitors she met, notes on the changing light through the stained glass window at different times of day. She wrote in the caretaker's shelter in the evenings by lantern light, her ink-stained fingers moving across the page in the small, precise handwriting her mother had once loved. 1 year later, Elsie sat on the stone bench outside the chapel door and watched a pair of deer move through the clearing at dusk. They did not see her. They passed within 20 feet of where she sat and then disappeared into the trees. The chapel behind her was dark and quiet. The stained glass window held the last light of the day in its faded colors. The caretaker's shelter had a warm amber glow from the lantern she had left burning inside. She thought about Father Ansel Voigt, a German immigrant who had come to these woods in 1923 with grief and a belief that grief required quiet, about Margit Lindholm, a girl who had lost her brother in the Mohawk River and had come to this chapel for 37 years to feel his presence in the silence. About all the people who had sat in these pews over the decades without explaining themselves, who had left their burdens on the stone floor and walked out lighter than when they had come in. She thought about her mother, Cora, who had read her stories every night and kept a small notebook of Elsie's best sentences in her purse. About Patricia, whose letter had pushed her out into the world, and who had, in her own careful way, given Elsie the last push she had needed. She understood now that some places are built to hold things. Not objects, not money, not coins, not sealed envelopes in velvet-lined boxes. Though those things had been there too. The real thing the chapel held was quiet. And the quiet, as Margaret had written, was what mattered. Everything else was just walls. That's the truth about forgotten places. They are never really forgotten. They are held. Held by the memory of the people who built them. Held by the memory of the people who visited them. Held by the forest that grows around them and the stones that settle into the ground beneath them. And they wait patiently for the next person who needs to find them. Not a person who wants to own them. A person who understands what they're for. The chapel had been waiting since 1971 for Elsie Finch. And when she had walked into the clearing and seen it for the first time, something in her had recognized something in it. The quiet recognized the quiet. The watcher recognized the place that was meant to be watched over. Elsie Finch was 20 years old and kicked out. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on a forgotten chapel in the woods of upstate New York. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments what's a place you've been that felt truly quiet. We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.